morning, everybody, and thanks for coming back for day 2. And we're going to talk about supply chain and how to improve ESG standards. So just to comment on some themes from yesterday, I heard some words such as quality, biodiversity, risk mitigation, ESG standards, protection, and Peru. And today, we're going to focus on aligning supply chain with corporate sustainability goals. And we'll discuss if we think that will improve the supply chain and make an effective transition to best practices. And things to think about and reflect on are operational. How do we operationalize this? How do we mitigate risk in the supply chain? Is it by reducing the risk of supplier reputation? And what other risks in the supply chain can we address by setting common objectives? The other thing is how we can strengthen our supply chain? What can corporations do to eliminate harmful practices and achieve the objectives? And finally, corporations make huge commitments and they say what they're going to get by optimizing the supply chain. The problem is, how do we get there? So those are the thoughts for the panels. And I guess I'd like to open with, what does the panel think are the real issues behind the supply chain? And why do we start with Andrea?
Great, thank you so much for that. I think there are many issues with the supply chain, one of them being the issue around traceability. So first, working with corporates to understand where they're sourcing from, to then understand what are the sourcing practices happening on the ground. And then once you have that understanding, the next question is financing and how to finance that transition that's needed.
Okay, Andrew?
Well, I definitely think traceability is a big issue, but I would add perhaps the most difficult one to understand when you're talking about restoring nature and biodiversity is there's actually, for me, it's the contracting, the relationships with producing landscapes. There's a massive power imbalance between the people who are sourcing these raw materials and the people who are creating them. And it's creating economies that lead to desperation for income and desperation that leads to degradation of land. It's a tough one to crack, but for me, I'd like to see that change.
Okay, great. And Martin?
Yes, and my perspective probably on this is more on the financial side. So I work in advisory to fund managers and SMEs in this natural asset space with recently a pretty strong emphasis on the smallholder farmer and how to get funding through to smallholder farmers who are key parts of many of these supply chains. So my perspective is that. And I think that there are many things we could address during this conversation, but one that I think is really important is that, of course, these supply chains have, to some extent, their own energy and function today already, but there are also many people like the funds I work with who are putting finance into them, aiming towards the smallholder farmer. Sometimes some of the issues are that may be done in a rather kind of focused way. So one point that I think is really important is, and it was mentioned yesterday in some of the very good discussions that we had yesterday, the idea of collaboration and bringing together all those parties who can influence the functionality, the sustainability of supply chains, which range from the financiers, where most of my work is, through NGOs, through the corporates who are drawing out the product, as Andrew was saying, have tremendous ability to influence what's happening in the supply chains, how to drive funding in a way which ensures that the right kind of product is being produced in the right way in the beginning. If you don't source things in the right way, you can't correct that later. So collaborating and the public sector, governments, how they create the basis for supply chain functionality, of course, they're very important. The public sector has a key role to play as well. So coordination, industry associations can play a great role there, of course, another important actor. But getting those parties to work together in a way that allows supply chains to function in a more sustainable way is a key need, I would say.
And Mikhail?
I would even go further back to basics. I think if you look at the supply chains and the problems they faced, very few actually understand the problems, let alone the root causes underneath these problems. They mix up very often the drivers and the consequences, and I think when you don't understand what's going on, then it's very difficult to come up with solutions. We heard yesterday Marshall talking about now you have to see it to understand it, and I think that's where you see often the problem, where lots of now standards, we talk about it later, have been developed now in offices, now in cozy offices in Amsterdam, DC or wherever, without understanding what is the reality in the field on the ground. And as long as you don't grasp where the real issues are, then you won't solve them. I mean, it's very simple. Just mentioned the word traceability. Well, traceability, I think, is a tool, probably not even the right tool to solve the problems. The impact of traceability on the issues we face, farmers, communities, the planet, will not be dealt with traceability. Even if you create legislation on traceability, will not change there, because it's not a problem the farmers face. It's totally different. And if you still talk about single supply chains, I think that's already now an issue, because these problems cannot be solved with a single supply chain, especially with existing sourcing structures. It won't work. You have to work on a community basis, you have to work on landscape, and then figure out how you can use these climate change risk mitigation tools and revenues to improve the social infrastructures. That's where the bottlenecks are for development.
And what do you think would have significant influence on the behavioral changes in the supply chain? You want to continue on with your thoughts there?
Well, again, I think that is probably the best word you can describe it. Now, how can you change the behavior of people? And how do you change the behavior of people? That's very simple. That's with money. So if there is no incentive for a farmer to do something differently, he won't do it. A CEO of a quoted company will not change his behavior or behavior of the company and the things to do if there's not some sort of incentive to do so, or the other way around, a kind of punishment if he doesn't. And I think when you talk about ESG, which is now, I think now probably a good tool to get certain things straightened out, that will be going through the wallet of the people who will or will not comply with what we expect them to comply with.
And Martin, from the financier's standpoint?
Yeah, and these are very immediate issues in my working life, and so this week I was involved in an investment committee decision to put together a structure to deploy funding indirectly down to smallholder farmers. Providing them access to markets was part of the package. Technical assistance was also part of the package. So creating an ecosystem, including the finance, is stuff that I look at regularly. In my working world, there is usually also the presence of public sector money, whether it's from DFIs or from other government sources, and so the ESG component is part of the agenda. That's not always the case. There are other sources of finance which don't have that inherent kind of responsibility aspect connected to them. But every initiative is different in the way it puts on the table the non-financial aspects and the incentivization to make smallholders or help smallholders produce their goods in the right way, if there is a right way of doing that. Because every initiative is different, there is some incoherence going on now. The world doesn't need to be completely homogenous. There's not one perfect solution to the non-financial aspects. But I think the point I'd like to make is that so long as that, it's key that component is on the table when these things are designed. And if it's done well, you've got a good chance of beginning to source the goods that need to come out of the far end of the supply chain in the right way. So from a financier's perspective, it's crucial that that stuff is on the table. And so when the smallholder farmer comes in through the door seeking funding or seeking support of some kind, that the person they're talking to has a responsibility not just to hold a narrow financial dialogue with that person, but has the other things that they have to put on the table as well, and try to make sure that those things are taken into account when making a decision or not to lend.
And Andrea, because I know you've worked with the small farmers and the
Yeah, I mean, it's really
contributors.
about changing your business practices, your business model, and engaging with your farmers, your suppliers, and building these relationships and supporting them to make that transition, whether it's to regenerative farming, whether it's to agroforestry, and also being there when things maybe don't always go perfect, right? So we're expecting farmers to transition, to change practices, but what happens if there's droughts or if yields change? We need to be able to support them through that change as well.
And Andrew?
Yeah, well, I liked what was said on one of the panels yesterday was the mention of changing mindsets. It's the hardest thing to change. It is the most impactful. And in my work, we're working frequently with corporates in what we call the bioeconomy. It often includes a lot of food and beverage, agricultural commodities, and such. We take two different approaches that lead to a couple of common themes that I see. The first is that we take a science-based approach, right? We want to understand how far outside of the thresholds of producing landscapes is your current supply chain, help prioritize where that is, and that leads you to understanding, okay, which communities do I need to engage with, what are the threats facing this, is it going to be more extreme weather, is it going to be more drought, is it going to be too much water at the wrong time, and guide the action that way. So one is being guided by science. The second is a systems thinking approach, getting a lot more holistic, understanding the root causes of these outcomes. And what frequently happens when we begin this exercise, people are just looking for a more effective supply chain strategy, sustainability strategy. They want to sign up to the SBTN. They want to get the brand benefits of all this. But when they start to look at the science and look at root causes, you start to see that certain business units, certain product portfolios have an expiry date. I mean, we already saw extreme supply chain disruption in the agricultural world this year and the year before, and that's only going to get worse. So the way that the supply chain is organized, the way the business is organized, how success is defined, starts to need to be changed there. And the last one I'll leave with is ultimately we need to move away from, hard to say, move away from shareholder value. We saw, I don't want to steal your thunder, we were talking about this earlier, but we saw that Patagonia just transitioned all of their ownership to a combination between a trust and a group of nonprofits fighting climate change because the founder couldn't tolerate the idea of it going on the public market where it would be subject to the incentives of quarterly earnings, short-term returns. And the more we can distance ourselves from that kind of thinking, the more we're going to see the outcomes we want to see for nature and for smallholder communities in the supply chain.
And one last point, just to build off that. We also need to start thinking about just the long term, right? Like, as you're talking about supply chains have been disrupted this year, what's going to happen in 2030? So this isn't a cost, it's an investment in the future for those companies.
So it's safe to say we need to look at a baseline. We look at what has happened up till now. And I think the COVID pandemic has given us an indication of how supply chains can get disrupted by outside forces outside of our control.
Yeah.
And then we have to do some sort of forecasting or trend prediction for the future, because if you can get the corporates and the financiers and the producers on board to understand that the trajectory could go multiple ways for 2030.
Yeah. And
So we have to map the different, go ahead.
yeah, I would just point out that it's not just COVID that disrupted things. Actually, more than COVID, it was record droughts in 8 different regions of the world with heat waves. You saw record heat in northwest India and Pakistan, and then followed by dramatic flooding. You see unprecedented heat wave all through China. The Netherlands has had a historic drought. It's been a lovely summer, but it's been terrible for water sources. It's going to affect food supplies next year. Plus, disruptions are coming from a lot of different directions.
Right, it's geopolitical as well as there are direct relationships to climate change, and then there are ones that are not, but they're still as catastrophic. Yeah. And then what I heard a lot about yesterday is how can we start weaving modern technology into these supply chains? I totally agree that it's behavioral, it's change management. You need to drive it from the people. There's not going to be an AI solution that's going to solve this. But is there some way to use technology to take the basics, the routine stuff, and make that more common and more collaborative? And then you can spend the last 20% on the important stuff around the behavior, the change management of the people, and the behavior straight through from the CEO down to their investors. Because at the end of the day, it's got to be a profitability index for everybody, so that the producer understands their contribution if whether they're raising cocoa and it ends up in chocolate, or it's coffee beans that ends up in Costa or Nero, or walnuts that end up in some confectionery somewhere else in the world. So how do we start thinking about modern tech? I know people have been talking and that there's a mixture here of technology and what I'd like to think thought management. Andrew?
Well, my view on this is not extremely well developed, so take it with a grain of salt. But I really like a lot of the Earth observation technology we were seeing yesterday. I think that's going to be very important for monitoring, guiding action, and priority setting. Combined with that, I would like to see the promise of technology be realized. The promise of technology is that we'd work 20-hour weeks and we wouldn't actually have to do this. For me, when I'm thinking about that in this context, applying technology on the farm, right? Drones, automated harvesting, or even landless tech, hydroponic or vertical farming, where does that come into play? For me, that portion needs to be guided by a couple of priorities. One, how can we spare land as much as possible for those products which don't need to be grown extensively on massive fields, but actually can be grown like they're grown here in these really intensive greenhouses, which have their own trade-offs. But if we can use that to spare nature, that'd be great. I'd also like to see a lot of the farm technology accrue more benefits to the farmer rather than just the service of it. So not selling their data, but maybe there's a use case, a subscription where they accrue ownership over the technology over time. Creative models of ownership that give the power to the farmers rather than trap them in a business model where they have to buy from someone every year. I would like to see that deployment of technology, personally.
And I know Mikhail has used a lot of EO observation.
Yeah. Yeah, so the ecosystem where we operate is mainly West Africa. So you talk a lot about smallholder farming systems, something very remote, isolated, and actually the only way to get good data and reliable data, objective data, is actually using these technologies. So you can check now what is going on in terms of forest deforestation, degradation, and so from the negative perspective, where most people look at, but at the same time developments of the recent years can actually also show you when biomass is increasing. You can even use certain LiDAR techniques where you can actually make a pretty good estimate of tree biodiversity because of the shapes of the trees and things. So it provides you with the data you need to make, say, an objective analysis to report on progress, because a lot of what we see today is actually measured by somebody somewhere at some point, maybe some in a bar filling out some sheet ticking boxes, and that is taken for granted. And with these observation technology, you can actually verify, validate, but you have to do it correctly. We heard that yesterday also a few times. That component of earth truthing and calibrating between different systems is key to get this reliable data. But once you got that, you can actually show when people stay within their concessions. If you talk about plantations, for example, or not. Do they degrade? Do they move into it or not at all? And what are the real causes of the large-scale deforestation? So you can get much more valuable information which you can report on and take proper measures. A lot of the information you find on deforestation is very basic. It shows only a sudden canopy drop. Well, that does not necessarily to be a deforestation. It can be, but cannot, not needs to be. So figuring out how that works is very, very important to be able to report it and show that you want the good guys or girls or want the bad ones, which can then be rewarded or not. So I think it's crucial. Mobile payments is also something like that. We use mobile payments, I think, since 2017. Initially, people said, no, farmers don't want it, farmers don't want it. Now, why people say that? Because once you pay the farmer directly on this mobile telephone, nobody can steal it from them anymore, and nobody can cream it off. That's why some of these intermediaries don't want you to use it, but once you use it, farmers are very happy with it. It's like a wallet, it's a saving account. So there are a lot of technologies which for us are maybe not so innovative or modern, which have very good way of very good usage in the ecosystem where we operate.
Yeah, because to add on to that, once you start giving them the ability to use mobile phones, then you're starting to increase the social media. You give them access to a whole nother world.
Yeah. We
that
actually work
they-
on a program, preparing a program together with UNICEF, where we will provide access, internet access for schools. But schools, of course, now they have their school times, but then in the evenings you can even do training for adults or all sorts of things which will be beneficial for the whole community. Once you have an internet connection, you can also talk about civil registration, which works nowhere in the areas we operate. So you can actually now provide birth certificates using an app. You can work on land tenure issues, land certificates. That's all based on that type of technology. It exists, but it's not used.
Yeah, okay. And Andrea, have you seen this with your communities that you've worked with?
Sorry. Well, currently at South Pole with some of our corporates, we're starting to measure and look into land use change. And so using remote sensing to understand where land use change is occurring. And I think that's a powerful tool, one, for understanding their emissions, but also for communicating that up the management level, right? So they have these images that tell a stronger story. And the other piece is also what you just said was using it to track and report on progress. So also starting to understand what is the soil carbon sequestration that's being built up in these farms so that companies can report and make credible claims also for any carbon reductions or removals that are occurring.
And from the financier's
Yeah.
point of view, and is
Yeah.
it seen as a positive?
Tremendously positive and a great potential. And going back to what I said before about coherence along the supply chain, I think obviously communication technologies and IT allows you to address that point quite nicely in terms of trying to make sure that the different components of the supply chain, right from consumer through to supplier, are being driven by the same types of objectives, ensuring that coherence and indeed incentivization in a coherent way of the different components of the supply chain. So technology allows you to do that. And going back to what was said slightly earlier, making sure that profits or benefits are properly shared through the supply chain is fundamental to that. So if all of the benefits are accumulating to a small part of the supply chain, the risk is that the other part of the supply chain falls into disrepair somehow and doesn't work in a coherent way. So making sure that that supply chain maintains a suitable license to operate also on the ground. It was discussed yesterday, I think. There was a good discussion on it yesterday, benefit sharing, making sure that those at the supply end benefit from profits being made elsewhere in the supply chain, ultimately makes that supply chain more robust, allows supply chains to function not just in the interests of corporate shareholders, but also in the interests of the different components along the supply chain, the farmers who are producing the goods in the beginning. We talked a lot yesterday about carbon credits and other forms of credits. Those where those are, where a supply chain can leverage those sorts of sources of income, that income needs to go to different components in the supply chain, and those who are working on the ground need to understand how their behavior or working in a certain way allows those things to be generated, and those things should trickle back down the supply chain in some way. So, long answer to the question, but technology allows that to happen better than it otherwise would, I think, yes.
So we can summarize it by saying there'll be a level of transparency.
It's key.
That's key.
Yeah.
And we're using innovation and change management and what could be considered innovation to the suppliers and the new communities that we're working with may not be the same as to the established Western world, but I think there's, applicability across the whole spectrum. The one thing that you always have to look at is the flip side. So do you think the technology would eliminate, if you would, the bad actors or the people who are trying to circumvent some of the specifications or objectives of the supply chain?
I think so, yes, but
Yeah.
If I may, I think it will make the usual fraud more difficult, for sure. But I think also we have to make sure that we use from the start the right technologies and methodologies, and some of them may be in parallel, so that if you measure now a biomass of a certain area, is that really what has been measured, and why is it different from the other methodology, and compare that and try to calibrate it with different systems. I think that's crucial. And especially because I think the carbon market now will boom at some point, because people figure out now how difficult it is and have to pay up up for the damage done. And there I think we should make sure that the technology we use is actually fit for purpose. We'll do what say, and then specifically focus on the people who are doing it correctly, and people who cannot meet the bar. I mean, tough. They'll face the consequences of not doing what they expect to be doing or have said they would be doing. And I think then when we get close to 2030, sometimes I say, at some point the world will run out of green paint. And then the guys who have not done anything, they will face the consequences directly, and hopefully the big way in their own wallets.
So do you think that through this and through the learnings from the technology, we'll be able to set standards and show the impact, whether it's positive or negative, on the supply chain? Andrew's kind of smiling.
Well, I was still, in response to your previous question, formulating my answer.
Okay.
Well, it's just that...
Both questions then.
Yeah. I don't think technology necessarily eliminates bad actors. It doesn't necessarily do anything. It's a tool, and how we use it and the system in which we're using it will kind of determine those outcomes. Hopefully it makes it hard for the current kinds of fraud to be perpetrated, but I'm sure new ones will pop up unless there's... For me, I actually personally react negatively to technology aimed around a trustless system. I think actually that's the problem. If it's a technology that can bring people together and form that trust and make the co-benefits for everyone in the supply chain, like Martin was talking about, actually real and personal, then I think then it can be a very powerful tool to eliminate or limit or correct bad actors. Ideally, you don't just sort of shove them out of your supply chain, but you bring them with you and improve them. Well, you have a lot more experience.
Yeah, I'd say so. And I think what you said is for sure. I mean, I would say the same thing here, but that's very much based, again, from a kind of Western point of view when you live in the Netherlands or in Switzerland or the US, where you can actually make these things work. There is actually a system which works. Now there is a legal system which is enforced, because there are legal systems there, in many countries. There are rules, regulations, all sorts of stuff, but they're not enforced, and that's where things start falling down. And it's partly related also to your question about the standards. Making standards is everybody wants to make standards, and I've been dealing with standards I think for the last 15 years or so, and every time they come up with new versions of the standards to improve the standard and improve the standard. But what I think is the bottleneck of all these standards is actually how do you do the implementation of those standards in these difficult ecosystems where we operate? Once that is up and running, how do you do the verification? The other procedures are a nightmare, and if you don't have the right audit procedures or compliance system to do the verification, then your standard is worthless. And again, then you talk about corruption and fraud, and that's why these things don't necessarily work the way we expect them to work, because they're not made by the people who have to use them in these conditions. They're made up somewhere else. And then I think the worst of it all is actually the actual reason why we have created these standards is to create an impact on the target group. And what's the target group are the smallholder farmers, at least in our case. How can we improve the livelihoods of smallholder farmers, their health, their nutrition, their training, whatever? Standards have not done an awful lot on that. Even on the major issues we talk about smallholder farmers of commodities, the deforestation, child labor, incomes, all the stuff. So standards is not just developing a list of criteria and stuff like that, but now how are you actually going to use it in the real world? And I think there we have to be careful with when we talk about ESG, that we not make the same mistake.
I think some of the satellite and other data that was being discussed yesterday adds into the whole story the accountability side. You've got the standards, you've got the traceability, hopefully, but that data starts to make it easier to hold people accountable if they're saying they're doing things and perhaps it's not really the reality.
But it's important to use it not to point fingers and blame, but to use it for the greater good and to improve and to show the positive effects.
Absolutely.
Is that a fair
It
statement?
can go both ways, yeah.
Yeah.
Both ways, yeah.
I think we have some questions coming in from the audience, so let's try the first one, which is, would meaningful engagement in incorporating smallholder perspectives be crucial? Do we always understand the perspectives and ambitions of the suppliers? Let's start with Andrea.
Yeah, absolutely. I think engagement with smallholders and any farmers that you're working with. So even if it's farmers in the Netherlands or farmers in Côte d'Ivoire, we need to understand what their practices are, what are their challenges, what are the key issues that they're facing. And even when we start talking about standards, if you talk to farmers, a lot of them may not be organic certified, but they're actually practicing very sustainable practices on their farms, right? And they just can't go through the process of a certification. So I think really understanding at the farm level what's happening and what their key issues are is crucial.
Andrew, do you have?
No notes. I mean, that's quite a leading question, I think, and I agree with it. I think we don't incorporate these perspectives, and it's more than just incorporating their perspectives. And thank you for your feedback and going on with business as
Yeah.
usual. I think it's developing those relationships with them. If that means going there and spending a month on the ground with them, then maybe that's what we need to do a bit more.
And also perhaps understanding that it's not a one-way relationship. I mean, there's significant capacity building requirements, sometimes technical requirements, and understanding that drawing in the product is one part of the relationship, but ensuring that in this case, the smaller farmers have the tools and other materials to do so is key as well. And I think a lot of corporates in the supply chains understand that quite well, but they don't necessarily always have the resources, financial or other, to do that themselves. And so there is a role for others coming in from outside the supply chain with either technical or other financial resources to make sure that this relationship works well.
I presume that suppliers is meant now the people buying the raw materials instead of supplying the smallholders with whatever fertilizer or other stuff. If that's the case, if you talk about big trading companies, I think it is not as complicated as people may think it is, because traders are there to make money. They're there to maintain a level of opaqueness. So asking transparency from traders is a bit of a thing. Now, put a bullet in your head, because they use the fact that it's not transparent. That's the model they make money with. So knowing something before somebody else, acting of something before somebody else, and if you explain everybody to everybody, there's no model to make money. So I think it's actually quite simple how that works. And the fact that you have to get these smallholders involved, I mean, depends a lot now what you expect in general to do. And often we talk about these smallholders, we talk about companies, we talk about traders and consumers. But I think a big role on both sides of these supply chains, basically all of them, is the role of the public sector. I think I might mention briefly, but not only here on this part of our part, western part of the supply chain, but definitely also over there. The fact that there is not really a proper system for property rights, there's not a system for civil registration and you name it. That is what puts a lot of pressure on the livelihoods of cocoa, coffee, cashew farmers, and you name it. And they don't own their land. There's not such a system in place, or not yet. They're trying to put it in place, but it goes very slowly because of lack of technology. So as long as you, as a smaller farmer, are not kind of now contractually engaged with that piece of land where you're farming on, would you do any investments? No, they won't do investment. They consume the money, or they use for something else instead of investing in their production system. And I think there a lot could be done, especially also now in certain cases. If you look at how is the distribution of the revenues of certain smaller commodities, well, look what the local governments are keeping there to do things, whatever they do with it. But most of them, they're not using that money to improve the situation for the growers of these commodities. So I think that there's quite a bit of thought to be done on how do you actually do that distribution. Again, there's a problem. Why is there? Actually, it's more a symptom, if you like. So what is the problem behind the symptom, and then figure out what are these root causes, and then you can start work on the solution instead of just parachuting. This is a solution, yeah, well, right, but not for the problem.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because we need to understand the consequences of the root cause. The root cause are the drivers.
Yeah.
And then we have the consequences or the problems. And then we have the visible symptoms. And then we have, I think what Mikhail had in one of our earlier discussions said, unintended consequences, which could be Ukraine and wheat, it could be pandemics, it could be, the things that we can't predict with climate change, the droughts, the heat waves, the weather cycles. I think that's more coming through from a climate change point of view, but these all need to be pulled together. And I think the other thing that's really important, and what I've seen from working with governments and corporate and public sector, there's EU specifications. And then once you get into Africa, there's local governments. And then one country I was working with, the overall government wanted to get a hold on what the country's natural resources were. But when you get down to the local government level, and then either the landholders or the people farming the lands, they all kind of get nervous when you're trying to expose all the pieces. And you're not going to get the corporate investments, I don't think, without having a clear understanding of the whole supply chain and then where the risks could lie. So I know that's kind of a circuitous diagram, but from an investor's point of view, what's the most important pieces? Is it public sector? Is it the actual farmers and suppliers? Is it the corporate? How do they, judge this? Do they take overall ESG numbers into account?
I think it's all of the above. A key an investor will look at when they're doing due diligence at the whole range of risks that a supply chain or a particular investment is facing. So I think all the things you mentioned are very important. I think one thing we've not discussed on this panel maybe very much is what you described there about the kind of the background here, the need for coherent public sector context. And so one of the projects I'm involved in at the moment is working with the International Food and Agriculture Organization, which traditionally has a very, very strong public sector presence and has done a lot of projects over many years with governments across all of the countries we're describing here in Africa and elsewhere. And that sort of organization has a responsibility, a role, a competence to try to work with governments, both national as well as regional and local governments, to try to make sure that the background context for a supply chain is as positive as possible and provides the right kinds of reassurances that investors will look for at a national level and also as you go down to the local level, such that they feel comfortable and confident that when they inject the finance they're looking to inject, that it will work from a public sector perspective. And that can involve helping to set regulations and rules, laws, capacity building, a whole raft of things. But investors somehow implicitly rely on that being there as well, that work is going on to make sure the public sector context is sound.
I think I saw a question out in the audience.
I may fumble this, but I'll give it a try. So, as somebody kind of an outsider coming to this conference, one of the things that really struck me yesterday was kind of the complexity of driving operational definitions, because you have public sector, you have the farmers, you have corporations, you have investors. And so as a market, you guys are working still to form this. But if you simplify it, if you think about it, you're basically creating a new crop. It's trees, and the product is the sequestration of carbon. So my question is, in an effort to build that bridge between driving greater forest land to sequester more carbon, how does technologies, for example, like remote sensing, begin to help build standards for where you decide to plant, how it's going, where it's getting worse, to kind of build a stronger bridge between the corporations that are ultimately buying this crop for their own benefit? So I don't know if that's clear, but like, where does that fit in terms of shrinking the bridge, making it tighter, helping those who you're investing all this money to build these forests? How do you think it can help standardize things and catalyze the market so that it becomes fruitful for all those parties?
I can have a go at that.
Okay.
If I get the question, it's a very broad subject you're raising, but I think the simplest answer that I would give is to narrow it down a little bit to specific examples. And one of the funds that I've worked with in the past, based here in the Netherlands, called the Forest Effect Funds, looks into making supply chains or making those who are using land operate in a way which protects and preserves forests, and therefore the perspective that that kind of investor or actor takes is to say, well, we're going to invest in businesses which use the land in a way which ultimately either directly or indirectly protects the forests, generates carbon credits for the benefit of the organization or business in question. And that's how you draw in the different threads that you're describing and I know this is a micro answer to a question which is a much broader question, but at a micro level, that's how it can work. Those organizations need to understand how to make the peripheral or the externalities work for the benefit of that organization. And if they do it right and those externalities result in revenues being generated for their business, the result is that forests are preserved and maintained in the way that we're all hoping that they will be. I know it's a micro answer, but I think that's the easiest way to deal with it, and that actually you can have a coherent sort of thought process if you do it that way.
Maybe I can add something, because I think we've got here two kind of different things here, because as you understand, I work a lot in West Africa now with smaller farmers in an area which is relatively green. We have been asked to introduce agroforestry systems as a kind of compensation for the deforestation, which does not really do the job. You talk now maybe 20 trees per hectare where you have 1,200 cocoa trees. So what's the impact? But still, the Europeans like to put a finger and point out to the smaller farmers when we have a desert just now south of the Pyrenees. Why do we not, as Europeans, work more on restoration, reforestation of the areas? Now we chopped down 500 years, whatever, 100 or 1,000 years ago, or even longer. I mean, there are some huge opportunities, and we still subsidize agriculture crop in Europe, which don't really have a market, but we spend money on it. Now, rapeseed is a good example. Why don't we use that funding to start now restoring some of the forest areas in France, Germany, and other countries? I think that is something I think which need to be discussed. And the other issue you face in countries where we operate is there is actually not an infrastructure at all to start working on reforestation. Finding seeds is a huge challenge. Once you have the seeds, how you get them to germinate, how do you set up the nurseries, how do you do the distribution of the trees, how do you make sure those trees survive? So if I see sometimes these claims of people, we're going to plant 20 million trees per year, well, I like to see it. We do about 500, 600,000 trees per year, and that is a hell of a job. So how on earth do people millions of trees in countries where there's no infrastructure to actually produce the seedlings to start doing the reforestation or restoration? That is a big bottleneck. And I think as long as you have not started doing this, you don't even know how high the hurdles are.
Yeah, agree. And it's the planting of it's the seedlings, the planting of them, making sure they survive.
Yeah.
That whole process takes so much time.
Yeah, and you lose so much on the way. Just getting the seeds is really a huge job.
Yeah.
You can use also wildlings, whatever, and other things. But if you just talk about seeds, to get them germinate, to wake them up. I mean, that is your job. So every time, on every step, you lose really a large percentage. And so if you talk, we're going to plant 20 million trees, you probably need 50 million seeds or something. Where do you find them? Well, I can't tell you. I don't know.
Andrew, any final words? We have.
Oh, I just wanted to point out the presence of the word accountability. We hear a lot about traceability or standards. I heard you say enforcement. To me, then there has to be the accountability systems in place. Not so much punishing a farmer necessarily for their actions, but rather identifying where the whole supply chain needs to come together on these things. When my nightmare scenario is that we don't actually deploy these accountability systems and verification through technology, and so we tell ourselves that we've solved the biodiversity problem, we've solved the climate problem, because we accounted it so, and the carbon markets say we did it, and then we just push. We still have a climate crisis because actually it's just creative accounting. So for me,
Exactly.
technology on the accountability and verification side, would be really nice.
Well, it's not just a linguistical problem, but there is actually another word which is equivalent of accountability in French. They also call it responsable, which is not the same thing as being accountable. So everybody is responsible, but being held accountable is a concept which is a complicated one.
So a few questions.
Haley, how are we doing? We have 2 more questions from the audience. We can do one. Okay.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. Martin and Michiel, if I understand you correctly, we are trying to develop a sustainable value chain. We try to check it, to monitor it, but we get a bit stuck at the first point, which is the structure and the governance in the field with the farmers. So what kind of instruments do we have there? Is it about cooperatives, or is it about enforcing a good model? Not enforcing is not a good word, but talking to cooperatives and farmers on the ground and really try to stimulate a model, because I see that it's a very sensitive issue, what you said, Michiel, that if a farmer doesn't own the land, if a farmer has only the right to harvest cocoa, coffee, or whatever, we try to bring them into a system which is more long-term thinking. But if the legal context or the land right context is not right, yeah, I think then you can propose whatever you like, but it will not fall into the right fertile soil, so to say.
Yeah. If I may? Yeah, Paul. I mean, this is of course a very important topic in the work we do, and we do work with cooperatives, but not an awful lot, because cooperatives in Africa are not the same as we think they are. I mean, they have a totally different membership structure. The boards of cooperatives are not necessarily defending the rights of the interests of their members. So the largest part of our programs in Côte d'Ivoire is actually a community-based model. So you do not talk with the president of the cooperative, no, you talk with the chef de village, and the chef de terre, and then the presidents of the different associations within the village. So you have a much larger representation on that village level, that community level. And as long as you know the support from the bureau, what they call the bureau, from the chef de village, once you have the support of those people, they have actually a lot to say and can move a lot in those villages, more than a cooperative can ever do. And then once you have done it in several of these communities, then suddenly, now, at least in the Ivorian context, then the sous-préfet gets interested, because the traditional chefferie is informal. That's not a recognized official government body, but it's important for the sous-préfet. And once the sous-préfet figures out, hey, that's interesting for me, because things going a bit better, at least in the right direction, then the neighbor sous-préfet will get interested in the other one, and then the préfet gets interested, and then you start things moving. And our experience is that up to that level things work actually quite okay. Then you start moving the machine. If you try to do it from the other way around, so if you try on a ministry level in the capital, Abidjan or Accra or Abuja, wherever it is, and then try to go down, that doesn't work so well. So the bottom up here works quite okay, and people will have it. We've got a lot of traction with that model, and it's not so difficult to explain to farmers how important weather is. Rainfall patterns are, I mean, climate, of course, but now already you can notice weather pattern changes in that part of the world, which has a dramatic impact on the harvest, especially the small harvest in our summer months, and that is really the cocoa beans you find are as big as peanuts. I mean, and that will have, of course, other implications again on their cash flow, on their the way they can use the money, because they have to borrow money because they don't have it, and wait until the next cycle, and you kick them in a debt trap which you'll never get out of.
Yeah, and I would just add a couple of points maybe there. I think maybe the fundamental one is that as you said, Paul, the context of people who have land ownership or who farm land is very complicated sometimes. So as a supply chain seeking product, it's important to understand the context of the organization, the cooperative, or the individual farm, or whatever it is that you're seeking to draw the product from. And flipping it around, farmers and other land users or owners are tremendously pragmatic people, and they will tend to sell their product to someone who gives them good benefits for selling that product to them and not to somebody else. So that making sure that as you fund or finance or decide where to source or how to source or
how to make sure that things are sourced in the right way, understand that relationship is, and getting that right is key. Michiel has said already very clearly, and it's right, that, and that's why when I was working with the Moringa Fund in a prior life, this idea of agroforestry was very central to how to do that. Some users of land are able to produce in a relatively monocultural way for the right reasons. Others naturally grow multiple things because it diversifies their risk, and understanding that is a key thing. If you take away the diversity, sometimes that makes it harder for someone to sustainably manage that land. And very, very quick point, which is separate somehow, but naturally this discussion that we have tends to focus on the land, but there's a whole other discussion which is very similar to do with the oceans. I just mentioned that because all the same issues here are present in the blue economy.
Yeah,
That's for another
definitely.
discussion though.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's for the next panel.
Yeah.
We're getting a lot of signals from Haley that we're over time, but thank you very much for the, yes.
Just one thing to Paul, because that's, I forgot about when you mentioned the word land tenure here. We actually use the revenues of the carbon sequestration to support farmers to get the land certificates. So we actually have that cross thing, which is important.
Yes. I think there's still a lot of questions. We can find each other outside at the coffee break. And thank you very much to the panel for the good discussion to start the day and get us awake in the morning. And look forward to the next version, which will be on the ocean.
Thank you.